When I was a little kid, there was a phrase that Christian parents used all the time, at least in the home that I grew up in. I don't think they meant it the way that it came across, but it came across kind of strange and almost like God was this mean person. But the phrase was this, God is always watching. How many ever heard that growing up? God is always watching. And it was almost used in a disciplinarian way, like, if you better not do that because God is always watching you. And it was almost like you call it like a church threat. Your parents, like, I can't watch you all the time, but God is watching you. That's the kind of mentality that it was in my life. What it made it seem like is that God was up in heaven with his Ring camera trying to catch a sneaky teenager. And how many older people are thankful they didn't have Ring cameras when you were around in your teenage life? Anybody? No, you're not willing to admit that in front of your kids, are you? But it's almost like this sense that God's always trying to catch you doing something wrong. That was the mentality that kind of it permeated in the church culture, at least in the late 80s, early 90s for myself. And it created this mentality that God was always looking for someone to strike down or to bring judgment on, like almost like God got joy out of striking someone down. And it created this idea of this, what is supposed to be this loving Father, God, creator of the universe, and you created this dictator that loves to punish his people. And that's not the mentality that we should have of the Lord. Does God see everything and know everything? 100%. Everything is under his sovereign reign and rule and control and his power, yes, but that does not mean that God is watching you just so that you will fail so he can strike you down or bring judgment upon your life. Today, Peter is going to close out in 1 Peter chapter 3 this section on household codes that he's been writing on over the last few passages. So for the last 4 weeks, we've been talking about these household codes that Peter's giving to the people. If you're new with us, we've been studying the 1 Peter letter that he writes to these Christians that are spread all across Asia Minor and they're being persecuted for their beliefs in Jesus. You think about the idea of Rome and the persecution they brought among the people of God, the Israelites, and now Christ's followers. And now Peter is going to close it out, and he ends with this idea of this phrase, the idea, or I guess where the idea that God is watching us comes from. God is watching us, and he means it in a very different way than what you probably heard as a kid, though. So 1 Peter chapter 3, we're going to be in verse 8. If you don't have a Bible, on the tables in the back of the room, we have some Bibles. Those are gifts for you. We'd love for you to take one and for you and your family. Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, and a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may attain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and to see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous. You see it? The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. This is one of those passages that has some really difficult things in it when you start breaking this down. But Peter, he's been talking about these household codes. He's talked to slaves. He's talked to wives, husbands. He's talked to us about how we interact with things like the government, like what is our role and responsibility as a follower of Jesus that is living in a world that can many times be hostile towards those that are followers of Jesus. And if you're not sure if the world can be hostile towards those that are followers of Jesus, let me remind you that what June kicks off for many people in the world. If you don't know, go look it up, and I'm not gonna make a big deal about it right now. We'll talk about that later. He's given us wisdom. How do we live and interact? And in this passage, he kind of wraps the whole section up and he puts a bow on it when he says, finally, in light of all that I've said and all we've talked about with codes and responsibilities and how you interact with the government, how wives are to be submitted to their husband, how husbands are to love and to care and shepherd their wives. And now all of that said, what does he say? All of you, verse 8, have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, and a tender heart and a humble mind. And so for the last few weeks, as he's talked about different kinds of household codes, you may have been able to check out. You may be here today and you're like, well, I'm not a wife, and so I don't need to listen to all of last week's message. I'm good to go. Or maybe you are and you're like, I just don't want to hear it because it was a challenging message. Maybe you're not a husband and you're like, I don't have to pay attention to the husband thing because I'm not a husband in this season of my life, and so I don't have to pay attention. But today, Peter kind of goes after everyone. This is for the entire church, and so he's putting a bow on all of this, and he says, finally, all of you. And he rattles off this list of 5 things that we as followers of Jesus should be paying attention to as Christ followers and how we interact, not with just the world, but with one another. And so this is a shift that Peter makes here in his household code, and he now puts the onus back on us as followers of Jesus. How do we interact with one another? How are we caring for one another? How are we loving one another? And so these are vital for us. And so he says the first one, he says, have unity of mind. Unity of mind. This is having the same thoughts and the same attitude. Unity is one of those attributes that at many times feels like it's unattainable. Unattainable. It feels like, well, how do we as followers of Jesus, how can we come together and have unity of mind? Because all of us in this room, we have different sets of, or different walks of life that we have come from. How you were raised is probably very differently than how I was raised. Where you were raised is probably different than where I was raised. And all the things that we walk in with preconceived ideas. We walk in with upbringings, with our own desires, our own preferences. Have we ever done a song on a Sunday morning that you don't care for? Probably. But guess what? Here's the beauty of church. It's not about you, is it? It's not even about me. You can ask Lindsay, there are some times that we do a song that I'm like, didn't like it. But again, I have to send that to the I don't care at Collected Church TV email. And so what it feels like with unity is we have all these different upbringings and desires, and we're supposed to just drop that at the door, and we say, you know what, none of those things matter, and we're just supposed to be all alike and kind to one another. Unity. Here's what I want you to hear. If you're taking notes, write this down, is that unity is not uniformity, but unanimity. Meaning this is that we are not called to look alike, dress alike, act alike, live alike. We are unique in who God has created all of us to be. There's a beauty in that. It would be a weird church if you walk in and everybody looked the same and dressed the same and talked the same. You know what they call that? A cult. We are different. All of us, each and every one of us. And there's a beauty in that. But the call for us is not to do that. The call is for us to keep our mind unanimous and united on the mission of God. Not on the things that we prefer. Not on the things that we desire, that we walk in and we're like, this is what a church has to look like or it's supposed to look like. We all have those things, and I get it. But we are to focus in on the mission of God, not on the secondary issues. He's calling us to live it out in the world with unity. Then he goes on, he says sympathy. Sympathy in the Greek, one of the translations is understanding. We're to live in an understanding way with one another. Now, for those in the room that you kind of walk around and your heart is just full of empathy. Anybody one of those people? God bless you. Anybody have a lot of empathy? You're always heartbroken for somebody, and you're like, oh, I feel so bad for them. And then there's the rest of us that are like, who cares? No, I don't say that. But maybe. We live with an understanding way. Here's something I know, the uniqueness of my role being a pastor is that I don't know everything that's going on in everybody's lives, but I do know a lot of your stories. I hear what's going on in your lives. I know when your marriage is struggling. I know many times when your kids are struggling. I know many times, that's the uniqueness of my role is I get to hear those things and those experiences. And we want to hear those things, and we want to walk with you during those things. But one thing that I've found in the few years that I've been pastoring is that none of your stories are the same. None of them. Each of you are where you are because of unique circumstances and choices and decisions. The temptation for us, though, is to make judgments on other people without knowing what they have walked through. All of us have different childhoods. We have different core values that we live by. We have different traumas that we have to process, unhealthy and unhealthy. And what Peter is saying here is if you were to have the life of following Jesus with the people around you, you cannot walk around judging people without knowing what they're walking through or what they have gone through. Walk in understanding towards your brothers and your sisters. Many times, though, we want others to get what they deserve, but we want we want life to go easy on us. And Peter's saying, no. Walk with understanding with one another. Walk with sympathy with one another. Because you never know, here's the reality of the world. You never know when it's going to be your turn to walk through something challenging. And if we reap what we sow, I don't know about you, but I want people to be sympathetic towards what I'm walking through. And then he goes on, brotherly love. This is a mutual love for one another as a brother should. Some of you hear that and you're like, hey, me and my brother, we did not like each other. We fought all the time. We hit one another. Like I grew up in an all-boy household, and like our love language was arguing. We loved it. It's like our favorite thing to do. So you might hear that and think, I don't know about that. But this right here is a protective love. This is one that Paul talks about often as well. Romans chapter 12, verse 10, when he says, love one another with a brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Love one another. Like, I care for you. I'll protect you. I'll serve you. I'll do whatever it is because you are my brother. And here's something that's so hilarious about families. Me and my brothers would fight all the time, but if somebody from the outside tried to do something to one of our brothers, we're like, don't you touch him. Right? Because there's just something inside of you. You're like, that's my brother. I know we just fought 2 minutes ago, but that's my brother. We are in Christ together, brothers and sisters in the Lord. If you grew up in church, and more than likely a more traditional church, we used to call everybody brother and sister. You remember those days? Some of it's a little weird, you know? Like when I was a first youth pastor, I was 20 years old. I was just started dating Lindsay, and the first time I came to the church, this older gentleman said, Brother Drake, and I was like, well, that's my grandfather. Brother and sister, there's an affection with that. Paul says we need to love, Paul and Peter both said we need to love one another like that. For the one that grew up in a healthy family, you hear this brotherly affection, and you're like, hey, I got it. I understand that. That makes sense. But for the one that grew up in an unhealthy family or a dysfunctional family, you hear this and you're like, if that's what the community of believers is, I want nothing to do with it. And my challenge to you is not to see it through the brokenness of the human lens, but see the beautiful picture of what God is saying in a healthy family dynamic. You are to love one another and care for one another, and it is the same for us in the church family. And then he goes on and he says, a tender heart. A tender heart. Some of the men in the room, you hear this and you're like, ain't nothing tender here. Because we're men. All men sound like that, evidently. This is simply being compassionate. We are to be compassionate with one another. And I know that doesn't sound very manly to the men in the room. But the reality is, we desire and long for that compassion in our lives. We need to be willing to give it as well. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, Paul again, he says, be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. Why? As God in Christ forgave you. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. You can tell that both Peter himself spent time with Jesus in flesh, and Paul had been impacted by the ministry of Jesus in the spirit. And what is the overarching theme of almost all that they write is we need to be loving and caring and tenderhearted towards one another. It's the very heart of God. We don't talk about it often, especially those that are more reserved, and you may have grown up in a home and a house that didn't talk about your emotions or know how to process your emotions. And so you think like, anytime the word brings up things like this, I just can't do it. That's not who I am. We need to be looking towards what Paul and Peter are saying, and what Jesus said for us is that we should be loving and caring and compassionate to our brothers and our sisters. And he goes on, he says, in a humble mind. This is the challenge. As a follower of Jesus is for us, each and every one of us, to not think too highly of our own self and our own spiritual life and where we are on this journey. Some of you in the room have been following Jesus for more years than I've been alive. I have a lot to learn from you as a follower of Jesus. What's one of my favorite things to do is to sit with people that have followed Jesus for a long time and just you just want to lean in and hear what they have to say. You have those people? But the challenge for us is that the more that we grow in this journey of following him, becoming like Jesus, and our sanctification process is to not allow pride to rise up in us. Listen to what John Stott says. Pride is your greatest enemy, but humility is your greatest friend. I want to be really clear on this for a moment because we've been putting more attention and more focus in on spiritual disciplines and spiritual formation. Who are you as a follower of Jesus really a lot of times is determined by what we do in the rhythms and the disciplines that we have in our life to become like him. But we have to understand also that it is only through the power of the Spirit, not through our own working and not through just our quiet time, that we become like Jesus. And the temptation is that we become prideful. It should never lead us in our spiritual formation to a higher view of ourselves. In fact, it is the exact opposite. It should have the opposite effect on us. But what happens many times is we get this mentality of like, well, did you do your quiet time this morning? Oh, you didn't. Well, maybe that's why you're having a bad day. Maybe that's why your kids are disobeying. You didn't do your quiet time. I want to show you a picture in this world of spiritual formation. This is called the grace gap. The grace gap. When you first give your life to Jesus, the conversion experience, what happens many times is you feel like, man, I'm just so aware of my sin. But the reality is the more that you follow Jesus, the more that you are aware of God's holiness and the gap between your holiness and God's holiness. The more that you follow Jesus, the more you see your brokenness and your fallenness, and you look at it and you're like, it is only by the grace of the Lord that I'm even able to call myself a follower of Jesus. And the longer that you follow him, it should look more like this, that the bigger picture of view of the cross in our lives, the sacrifice that he made for us, not pride in our lives. Is that what we're doing? Are we allowing the grace and the mercy of Jesus to pour into our lives each and every single day to remind us that it is not by our discipline and our willpower, but it is with the humble beginnings of the grace of Jesus that has been poured out in our lives? C.S. Lewis says it this way: pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. It is the anti-God state of mind. What a humbling line. Now, I grew up as an athlete playing baseball and a few other sports, but mainly baseball. And one of the things that was the biggest struggle for me is that you have to walk around with a little bit of a sense of pride of your abilities and your athleticism. If you walk out there like trying to be friends with everybody, you're going to get destroyed on a football field, right? Like, hi, buddy, how's it going? Poof. You got to have a little bit of sense of pride, right? You got to have a little bit of like grit to you. That's the reality. There's kind of the one up thing, like, oh, I'm gonna do better, and I'm gonna do better, and I'm gonna do better. And then you come to this life of following Jesus, and it's like, wait a second. I can't have pride. I shouldn't have pride. Some of you that grew up playing sports, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For the others, you're like, wow, what is he talking about right now? Verse 9. He says, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for to this you were called that you may obtain a blessing. Now Peter switches here from household codes and how we interact with one another, and he's now saying how we interact with the world that is around us. How do we, as followers of Jesus, interact with the world around us that is hostile towards believers? Now, when we talk about hostile towards believers, more than likely what's in our mind is something that would be considered minor to what the early church was experiencing. And Peter is writing to these people who are having their lives ripped up and taken from them. Christ followers beheaded, hung on crosses, burned alive as human torches across Rome. And what does Peter say? He says, how do we interact with that world that is hostile towards us, facing persecution? This is during Nero's reign, who is known as the most evil and brutal rulers in Rome's history. And so this is not for the faint of heart. Could you imagine being a Christ follower in modern day Turkey? You gather with the church of God, the people of God. You sit down in this room, and Peter, the apostle, writes you a letter together, and you're like, oh, we can't wait to hear what Peter says. And you open it up, and you've been tortured. You've lost family members. You're living in a land that you don't know. And Peter says, do not return evil for evil. And it's got to be like, air out of the room. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling. It's so contrary to our human nature, to our natural inclination. For most people that were raised in the South, that's my only experience. I don't know if you were raised in the North. This is not to exclude you, but we have better food. But the reality is, growing up in the South, you may have heard a phrase, something like this. You better not start a fight, but you better finish it. Never throw the first punch, but you better throw the last. You know those sayings that you heard as a child? The life of following Jesus sounds a lot different than that, doesn't it? Here's what we have to wrestle with as followers of Jesus. Is the culture that I am brought up in, is that winning over what the Word of God says? That's a difficult question, isn't it? We cannot read the scriptures with American Western eyes and think that, oh, this doesn't apply to us because Peter was writing to people in the first century. No, he says, don't return evil for evil. Paul says it in Romans this way, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to what to do, what is honorable in the sight of all. What is their focus seems to be on how we respond and how it's going to be received in the world. How we respond to those that persecute us and revile us. And he's saying, like, hey, I want you to think about, as a follower of Jesus, how is this going to look to the world around us? Jesus himself on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. You've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. I can guarantee you this is not in any John Wayne movie ever. Right? This is not in our culture. This is something we look at and we're like, we'll pass over that. Even some of you here today are like, I ain't doing it. I don't believe this is about being a pacifist where we become a doormat to the world, to the culture, and we let people defend, you let people walk all over you and beat you. And I don't think that's what Peter and Paul are saying. I don't think that's what Jesus was saying. This is not to say that you can't defend your family, because I can guarantee you, I apologize if it offends anybody, but I don't. If somebody comes into my home, I'm going to make sure they feel really, really welcome. I just want you to know that. You know what I'm saying? Because there's a duty and a responsibility as a husband to be the protector of their family. But it is to say that if you're going to lean one way, it's not going out in the world looking for revenge and always looking for a fight. Returning evil for evil is, here's what we know. It has never won anybody to the kingdom. And that is the ultimate goal, isn't it? That we as followers of Jesus would win people to the kingdom. Returning evil for evil, nobody's ever said, you know what? I love the way that you did that. I'm going to follow your God. He says this, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. Now, Peter says, if you do what Jesus calls you to do, you're going to be blessed. This isn't work-based salvation, but Peter's made it very clear throughout his letter that we are followers of Jesus by the grace of God only, but it is to say that we are blessed because of the obedience that we live out. And we can't ignore that fact of the scriptures. Bless those who persecute you, bless those who revile you. the second part of that you may obtain a blessing. But this first part where he says, bless those who persecute you. For a lot of you in the room, you hear that and you're like, hey, you know what? I cannot do the return evil. Like that one's easy. I'm fine to not return evil. Like that one's good. But when Peter says, bless those who persecute you, like that's kind of like the drawing line. Line in the sand. Like I cannot return evil, but I'm not going to pray a blessing over them. A few years ago, I say few, everything's a few years ago. I'm at that age now. There was a country song that said, I pray your brakes go out while driving down a hill. That's not the kind of thing that Jesus is calling us to. It's not what Peter is saying. He's saying pray blessings over them. Listen to what Thomas Schreiner says. By blessing, Peter means that believers are to ask God to show his favor and grace upon those who have conferred injury upon them. Talk about a difficult passage. A difficult task. This is hard. Asking God to show favor upon someone that hurt us or persecute us, the exact opposite of human instinct. But this is the life of following Jesus, and it's not always easy. It's not always the way that seems right to man, but it is the way that seems right to what God has called us to. And I want to give some context and a caveat here. This is not a verse that Peter would say that if you are in an abusive situation or an abusive cycle that you just need to tough it out and deal with it. Verses like this have been used by many for many years that would say that listen, if you're in abuse, you just need to deal with it, pray blessings over your abuser, and just kind of let the Lord sort it out. That's the mentality that some have. And I want to give a caveat here. This is not about that kind of situation. If you are in, or you know somebody that is in an abusive situation, they need to be taken out of that situation. The Lord's design and plan for you is not to live in abuse. But remember what he's saying. He's talking about the people that are mistreated for their faith do not respond with evil. And as powerful or as awful as it can sound, especially to abuse victims, we're still called to forgive. We're still called to pray that God would show mercy and favor on that person, although they don't deserve it, because forgiveness is the only thing that has ever broken the cycle of revenge. You go get that person back, guess what's coming next? They're going to try to come back and get you. Verse 10. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. Peter, in this verses 10 through 12, quotes Psalm 34 almost word for word. Changes the person that it's written in, but it's almost word for word what he quotes here. As King David is being chased by Saul, he's hanging out with Absalom, and if you know the story, it's like this wild story. He acts like a crazy person, spit drilling down his beard, and just chaos that's happening in Psalm 34. But Peter uses this psalm in a unique way to remind the readers of this passage in Psalm 34. Let's look at verse 17. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all of their troubles. So what is Peter saying here? It is the Lord who delivers you out of all of your troubles. It is not by your evil reviling or your attack against somebody. You will not be delivered by that. Actually, it's the exact opposite. When you return evil for evil or reviling for reviling, you're going to be held captive to that unforgiveness until you learn to forgive. And Peter is saying, as a follower of Jesus, listen, you need to let the Lord handle it. That's why he gives these cautions. Don't take it in your own hands. Don't return to evil. Let the Lord's justice rain down on people one day. Verse 11. Let him turn away from evil and do good. This is one of those, like, the life of following Jesus is not a life of passivity. That we just sit back and we're like, God's just going to do whatever he's going to do, and I'm just going to let him do it because he's the creator of the universe and he's sovereign, and so just let God do what he does. That's a passive kind of mentality. Yes, is God in control? 100%. But there's still a call to action here. What does it say? Let him, the follower of Jesus, turn away from evil and do good. We're not called just to avoid evil, but to do good. You see the difference? What happens a lot of times is people will choose one or the other. Okay, in the world and in the kingdom, I'm going to just avoid evil, but I'm not going to do good. And the Lord's going to be happy with me because I've been disciplined and I've not been sinning and I've been doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing. And he says, no, you should run from evil, but you should also be doing good. And then you have the other side, the people that do good, and they focus on things like social justice and things in the culture and the world, and they think that that is the only part of the gospel, and so they've misrepresented the whole counsel of God. And then they don't worry about the evil side. They're just like, I'm just going to do good and focus on that. Verse 12. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. The eyes of the Lord. This is not him watching. I want you to hear me. This is not the Lord watching you, waiting on you to trip up and make a mistake. He's not trying to give you a gotcha moment. The Lord is not. But it's that the fatherly eyes, his fatherly eyes, like a good shepherd, like a good father, are watching us and protecting us. You see the difference when you were raised, and it's like the Lord's always watching you, but you better watch your step. But what Peter is saying is, the Lord cares for you. He's watching out for you. He's not just watching you, he's watching out for you. There's a big difference there. He's open to their prayer. Just like I said last week, when husbands don't live with their wives well, that the Lord will not hear their prayers. This is the opposite of that. What does he say? That the eyes of the Lord are open to the righteous and his ears are open to their prayer. When we live the life that God has called us to live, his ears are attentive to us. His eyes are watching us. And we have to be careful with this one. Because the temptation for us is that we think that if we will obey to a certain extent, then God is going to love us more. That is not the case. It's not about him loving you more. You have never been more fully loved by God in your lowest moment of your life. You can't change the love that he has for you. But it does say that he will not listen to our prayers, and he will listen to our prayers depending on how we live in obedience to the word of God. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Notice that it's the Lord's face, not your works in return to what somebody has done to you, but it is the Lord's face that is against the evil one. I want to close out this sermon by something that I don't think I've ever done, just reading a portion of a story. Team, you can come. One of my favorite people to study in history, Corrie ten Boom, if you've ever heard of the book, man, my mind just went totally blank. Hiding Place, thank you. The Hiding Place, it is a phenomenal book, probably in my top 5 books I've ever read. Corrie ten Boom and her sister were captured after hiding people in their home, hiding Jews in their home from the Nazi Germany regime. They were taken and held captive at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. And after the war was over, Corrie ten Boom, she went back to Germany. I want you to hear this for a moment. This Polish woman went back to Germany and preached the message of forgiveness to the Church of Germany. I want to read what she says. She says, it was 1947, and I'd come from Holland to defeated Germany with the message that God forgives. It was the truth that they most needed to hear in that bitter, bombed-out land, and I gave them my favorite mental picture. When we confess our sins, I said, God cast them into the deepest parts of the ocean, gone forever. The solemn faces of the people stared back at me, not quite daring to believe. There were never questions after a talk in Germany in 1947. People stood up in silence, and in silence they collected their wraps, and in silence they left the room, and that's when I saw him, working his way toward forward against the others. One moment I saw the overcoat and the brown hat. The next, a blue uniform and a visored cap with a skull and its crossbones. And it came back to me in a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights, the pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor, the shame of walking past this man naked. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath the parchment skin. Betsy, how thin you were. Betsy and I had been arrested for concealing Jews in our home during the Nazi occupation of Holland. This man had been a guard at Ravensbrück concentration camp where we were sent. Now he was in front of me, hand thrust out. A fine message, Fraulein. How good it is to know that, as you say, all of our sins are at the bottom of the sea. And I who had spoken so glibly of forgiveness, fumbled in my pocketbook rather than take that hand. He would not remember me, of course. How could he remember one prisoner among the thousands of women? But I remembered him and the leather crop swinging from his belt. It was the first time since my release that I had been face to face with one of my captors, and my blood seemed to freeze. You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk, he was saying. I was a guard there. No, he did not remember me. But since that time, he went on, I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me for the cruel things that I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well. Again, the hand came out. Will you forgive me? And I stood there, I whose sins had every day to be forgiven and could not. Betsy had died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply for the asking? Could it not been many seconds that he stood there, but his hand held out? But to me, it seemed like hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing that I ever had to do. For I had to do it. I knew it. The message that God forgives has a prior condition that if we forgive those that have injured us, and if you do not forgive men their trespasses, Jesus, neither will the Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. I knew it not only as a commandment of God, but as a daily experience. Since the war ended, I had I had a home in Holland for victims of Nazi Germany. Those who were able to forgive their former enemies were able to return to the outside world and rebuild their lives, no matter what the physical scars were. Those who nursed their bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple as horrible as that. And as I stood there with a coldness clutching my heart, but forgiveness is not an emotion, and I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and that will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Jesus, help me, I prayed silently. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one who stretched it out to me, and as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder and raced down my arm and sprang into our joined hands. Then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried with all my heart. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I had never known God so love intensely as I did then. Should you bow your heads with me this morning?